When taking a photograph, the photographer has to decide what they're trying to emphasize in the photograph. If depth of field is important to the photographer, then they'll want to focus on aperture or setting the f-stop first. If capturing movement or motion is more important for the composition, then the photographer will want to focus on the shutter speed. Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO all work together in order to give your camera and your image the proper exposure. Let's talk about aperture first. Aperture is the diameter of the opening of your lens. It's located inside your lens. The larger the diameter of the aperture, the more light that reaches the film or image sensor. Aperture is expressed in f-stops. You'll often see it as an F and then a number, often a decimal number. The smaller the F number, the larger the opening. And aperture controls depth of field. So in these examples, a lower F number, an f1.4, is much wider of an opening than an f16. Look at the comparison. This is something that you'll have to memorize because when you go to take a picture, if it's a low lighting scenario and you don't have a lot of light, you'll want to use a lower f-stop to let a lot more light into your camera. It's very difficult to take a high f-stop image inside of a low lighting setting. Once again, an f1.8 versus an f29. Now, the reason you want to choose a different aperture for your image is to affect the depth of field. So it controls how much light reaches your image sensor, but it also controls how sharp or blurry the depth of field is. So in this one, this is an f40. It's a much smaller opening than this one, the f3.5. Notice the difference in the depth of field. The smaller opening gives you a much sharper depth of field than the larger opening. Compare these three images, an f5.6, a fairly wide opening of an aperture, very much blurs out the background, as opposed to as you shrink down the aperture to an f8, it gets a little bit sharper, and then an f22, a very small opening, gives you a very sharp depth of field. And these were taken with the same lens, they're the same exposure, but look at the depth of field here. With a 1.8, it blurs out very quickly and very dramatically from where you're focusing. With an f20, when you focus on the front glass, look at how sharp all the rest of the glasses behind it stay. Here is an animation of a camera. Inside the lens is where the aperture is located. The aperture can be set to a very tiny opening like this one, where very little light is getting in, or a much wider opening like this one, where a lot of light is pouring into your camera. This directly affects how fast or slow the shutter moves. A wider opening is a lower f number, letting more light into your camera. A tinier opening is actually a higher f number, letting less light into your camera. If the focus of your photograph is the depth of field, then you're going to first set the aperture by holding the plus or minus AV button up in the corner, using the dial to set your f-stop. We'll use a low f-stop for this one. And then you have to find the proper exposure by using your light meter, which is actually in turn changing your shutter speed. So here at about 1/50th or 1/60th is the proper exposure for this image. And then I can of course adjust it along the way. If it needs to be darker or lighter, I can go this way to make my image brighter and this way on the light meter to make my image darker. The type of lens you use on your camera will directly dictate how large or small your aperture opening can be. A zoom lens versus a prime lens that doesn't zoom at all versus a smaller zoom lens. They all have different aperture or f-stop capabilities. This is the standard zoom lens that comes on the camera. It only goes from 18 to 55, but it will zoom in and out. And the lowest this f-stop will go is says f4.5, but with a lot of these lenses, if you zoom in or out, it may change the f-stop a little. So you kind of have to watch that. So 5.6 is the lowest it will go if the camera zoomed out, and when it's zoomed in, 3.5 is the lowest it will go. This 50mm prime lens, which means it does not zoom, has a much wider aperture capability than our standard lens. So if you look at the back of my screen here, if I hold down the AV plus or minus button and I scroll to the left, this lens will go to an f1.8, which is a really wide opening and will give you a very shallow depth of field. If I go the opposite way, this lens will go to an f22, which is a fairly small opening. This zoom lens allows the user to zoom in and out, and this has totally different f-stop capability. So with this one will only go to an f4. However, when you zoom into something, it further exaggerates the blurriness in the background and will give you the illusion of a wider f-stop.